Kind of a big question. Which heroes fought in the Trojan War? It's a bit of a list. Famously, they were pretty bad at it at first, but they quickly learned. I wonder if this question is meant for me. Did the Greeks have navies? Yes, they did. In fact, earlier than they did cavalry. Hello everyone, my name is Roel. I'm ancient historian at Lincoln College, University of Oxford, and I'm here to answer frequently asked questions about my field, ancient Greek warfare. First, I'm going to answer some general questions, and then we're going to go into a few more specific questions about the Trojan War, about the Persian Wars, Peloponnesian War, and some other conflicts. And hopefully we'll have some interesting things to say. Who did the Greeks fight? Everyone. I mean, basically everyone they could find. And if they couldn't find you, they would give it a good go looking for you. Greeks in this period, in ancient times, thought of war as pretty normal. It was quite a big part of their lives to jump to warfare as a way to resolve conflicts between themselves and other communities. So they often fought wars with their neighbors over perceived slights, over injustice, over territorial disputes, over questions of honor, legitimacy, breaking of the rules, whatever else. And so warfare was quite a common thing for them. But they also fought wars against non-Greeks around them. So they fought wars against the Thracians and the Etruscans and the Carthaginians and the Persians, of course, and peoples of North Africa. Everywhere they encountered people, either because they were themselves trying to carve out territory, or because those peoples either wanted them gone or had their own expansionist designs in mind. So who did the Greeks fight? Yes, basically everyone in the world. Next question. How did the Greeks fight? That's kind of a big question. I spend a lot of time studying this. They have very limited means of mustering military force because they don't have a lot of money, they have small populations, most of their population can't leave home for any length of time without crashing the economy essentially. So how did the Greeks fight? Well, in really quite modest ways most of the time. A lot of their early wars were essentially border raids. Later on they do start mustering large citizen armies, but those armies are just composed of regular citizens and they can't leave home for very long. Only a few states had the means to do things like build elaborate fortifications or put together war fleets. And it's only later when these states grow richer and more populous and more powerful that they start to have, overseas campaigning, overseas conquest, prolonged campaigns like sieges and things like that. So how the Greeks fight initially in very basic ways. And then later on, their warfare becomes more and more complex and they start to be able to take on bigger and bigger opponents. And this obviously culminates in the end with, Alexander the Great uniting the Greek world and taking on the Persian Empire. What weapons did the Greeks fight with? They would use spears and swords, javelins, bows, slings, all the kind of weapons that you find on a pre-modern battlefield. The average Greek warrior, perhaps, just numerically speaking, was a light-armed warrior who fought with a rock, perhaps, that he found on the battlefield if there was nothing else, but otherwise with some javelins, with a bow and arrow, or with sling stones. If he had a bit more money to equip himself, because the state was not paying for any of his equipment, he had to afford it for himself. If he had the money, he might buy some body armor, he might buy a long thrusting spear and a shield, and then fight that way. In that style of fighting, short swords were also prominent secondary weapons. Early in the 4th century BC, they developed a totally new kind of weapon which can throw projectiles at much greater range than anything else and larger projectiles than a human being can project. But this is something that develops first in that period, and initially, these weapons are really quite modest. We should imagine them as sort of large bolt shooters. And it takes a while for that to really develop a presence within Greek warfare. And then, of course, the other weapon they fight with is warships, which are themselves kind of a weapon. Their main warship, the trireme, is itself essentially a floating ram. It has a very large crew of rowers to allow that ship to get stuck into other ships, to ram them and hopefully either sink or disable them. So that is itself kind of also a weapon, but fundamentally that is the full range of what the Greeks would use. Next question, did the Greeks fight on chariots? It's an interesting question, actually. Chariots appear in Homer. So in the Iliad, there are warriors fighting in chariots. They jump off them to fight, and then they jump back on to get away. So they don't really fight in chariots, but they use them as something that's been described as like battlefield taxis, essentially. They use them to get around quickly. And historians are divided over whether that's a real practice, maybe from the early archaic period, so from the 8th or 7th century BC that they really did this, or whether this is essentially something that the poet doesn't quite understand, it's fantasy, or it's something that maybe is reflecting a bad memory, a badly preserved memory of earlier times, the Bronze Age, when this kind of chariot would be more common. Next question, did the Greeks have cavalries? Yes, they did. This is something that's sometimes considered to be like un-Greek or alien to the Greek world, because we have some battles, like in the Persian Wars, where the Greeks don't seem to have any men fighting on horseback. And the assumption has long been that this is because, horses just don't feature very much in Greek warfare. But the fact is that shortly after the Persian Wars, you get very prominent accounts of the capabilities of cavalry from Thessaly, from Boeotia, from Asia Minor, from other parts of the Greek world. And it's spreading from there until towards sort of the middle of the 4th century, about a century after the Persian Wars. It seems like every Greek state worth its salt will have some cavalry of its own. So this is something that is emerging in the period of the Persian Wars. It's not quite developed yet, but soon after that it becomes very normal. And this cavalry has a very important role to play in Greek warfare. There are a lot of different roles that cavalry is especially suited for. Protecting farmland, harrying the enemy, keeping them together, keeping them in place, fighting their scouts, fighting their outriders, preventing them from plundering, but also, for instance, fighting in battles, being this mobile force that can intervene where needed, and often actually deciding the outcome of pitched battles. Cavalry is a huge part of Greek warfare, and towards the end of the classical period, they actually become such a big feature of it, that when Alexander the Great musters his army to cross into Asia to attack the Persian Empire, there are more Greek horsemen in his army than Macedonian and Thracian horsemen put together. There's a huge element of his force that is Greek cavalry, because the Greeks have so many of these horsemen ready for battle. Did the Greeks have navies? Yes, they did. In fact, earlier than they did cavalry, as we've just discussed. I mean, they had navies at least from the late 6th century onwards, and probably later. And some of their most famous exploits in war are thanks to their large fleets of warships. The Greeks live by the sea. Naval connections and trade were extremely important to them. And of course, they realized early on that if you could dominate those, if you could secure and protect those sea lanes, then it would give you a special amount of power. Your influence over, for instance, island states would be absolute, because no one could get to those states without your permission, without your say-so. So Greeks start developing this idea of naval power, thalassocracy, rule of the sea, quite early on. And by the time of the Persian Wars, you have different states already vying for naval power. Aegina, Athens, Samos are all noted naval powers. Many of those are conquered by the Persians and used to build a fleet to send against Greece. But it is the Athenian-led, or the Spartan-led, but mostly Athenian fleet of the coalition against the Persians that wins the great victory at Salamis, that actually drives off the Persian fleet and more or less turns the tide of the Persian Wars. So from then on, the Athenian navy becomes this huge factor in the Aegean. They end up projecting their power into the Black Sea, into the Eastern Mediterranean, into Sicily, everywhere else. Athenian naval power becomes one of the driving forces of the history of the 5th century. Next question, did the Greeks do sieges? Again, famously, they were pretty bad at it at first, but they quickly learned. So initially in Greek history, sieges don't really seem to happen. Sometimes cities are taken by surprise. Sometimes cities are quickly overrun, but you don't really get good stories of, prolonged operations against a fortified settlement. The story of the Trojan War is kind of exceptional, because we hear of this 10-year war against the city. But when you read Homer, you realize that the way it's described is not actually a siege. The Greeks are just kind of sitting outside of that city, and they have battles in the plain between the city and the Greek camp. So it's really not a siege in the way that we understand it, with engines going up to the walls and people being starved out. And in fact, it's only decided because of this famous trick with the Trojan horse. And the reason for that, I've already mentioned, these Greek states have very limited means. Keeping an army in the field is very expensive, it's very difficult. It requires a lot of logistical know-how to be able to get supplies to them and to be able to keep these men in operational activity when they're not away, when they're not tending to their fields and their shops and whatever else they have at home. So they are out of your economy. You're projecting them out into the world and using them for a military campaign. It's very difficult for a small community to sustain that. So initially, Greek sieges are, they have to be very limited. If they're not over quickly, they don't happen at all. Did the Greeks dig ditches? I wonder if this question is meant for me. Surprisingly, not that much, much to my disappointment, obviously. But the Greeks sometimes would try and reinforce a settlement with a ditch, for instance, on a side of the walls that was facing a plain. If it's easy to approach, you dig a ditch in front of that and you'll be much safer, because it becomes more difficult for an enemy with engines or ladders to approach your walls. But generally speaking, Greek fortified settlements and forts were placed in easily defensible positions. So for instance, on hilltops, on mountainsides, or on sort of promontories sticking out into the sea. So most of these Greek positions rely on natural defenses, which are reinforced by building walls, reinforced with towers and parapets and all sorts of things, but fundamentally don't rely on earthworks in the same way that fortifications do in places where the land is more flat and where it's easier to construct those things. Next question. Who was the best Greek warrior? Canonically, Achilles. He's famously described as best of the Greeks and legendarily the best warrior among the Greeks in the Trojan War story. Historically, there's much less interest in this kind of question. There isn't so much a sense that individual warriors make or break the fate of campaigns, and so there isn't as much of a sense that individuals should be considered the best of the Greeks and should be honored accordingly. You get a couple of battles in which Herodotus, who is a historian, he is still describing for us who was awarded within the Greek army with the prize for valor. We hear of Sophanes among the Athenians, and also Pythias, an Aeginetan marine who fought so nobly during the Battle of Artemision against the Persians, or some of the actions before that the Persians actually captured him and took care of him and treated his wounds so that they could have him fighting on their side since his ship had been captured. So there was some understanding that some of these warriors had done sort of great things and that they deserved to be honored for it. But when we hear about what those things actually are, I mean, there's very little detail. I mean, this is really just about the basic level of valorous conduct, just being willing to stand and fight and face the enemy, even at the expense of your own life. Next question. Was the Trojan War real? Kind of a big question. There's a couple of different things to distinguish here. Like, one thing is that the story that we know comes primarily from the Homeric epic poems, right? So these are tales that were written down around the year maybe 700 BC, maybe a little later. They're the earliest sources written in the Greek alphabet that survive down to our time. The time in which they believe the Trojan War took place conforms more or less, if we squint, to the very end of the Bronze Age in Greece, when Mycenae was a very powerful kingdom and when one of the layers of the ancient city of Troy was destroyed. And so it's been incredibly tempting for many historians to say that these things are not coincidence, that there was a real Trojan War at the end of the Bronze Age, and that when Homer, or when the poet putting together the epics, referred to this war as happening in the heroic past, they were actually referring to the traces of a real memory of a historical event. And some people are very optimistic about this. They say we have plenty of evidence from Hittite sources and from archaeology to attest that there was a real Trojan War. Others are much more cautious and say we really cannot say, even if we have these pieces, whether this is in any sense the Trojan War that is described by Homer, or whether any of the characters or any of the events that were described in the epic cycle have any relation to real history. I am myself on the skeptical camp. I don't think the Trojan War ever actually happened. What we're dealing with is an epic poem about a story that fits very, very nicely within the world of early archaic Greece in terms of how societies are organized, how they're run, what the concerns of the individual people are, where they're based and what they do and what kind of equipment they carry. This is an early archaic Greek world. That's what's being described to us, and that's why these poems are interesting. Next question, who started the Trojan War? Different accounts of that. It's a story that goes further and further back. You know, there's always sort of a first cause for everything. According to the sources on the Trojan War, so the epic cycle, the first instigator was Zeus, who wanted to trigger it. And so he sent Eris, the goddess of strife, to a wedding party to essentially provoke a fight between different goddesses about who was the most beautiful, which they submitted for arbitration to Paris, who was a Trojan, who didn't know at the time he was a Trojan prince. He gave the apple, gave the prize, gave the title of the most beautiful to Aphrodite in exchange for the promise that Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, would fall in love with him. But Helen was already married to Menelaus, the king of Sparta, or rather Helen of Sparta was already married to Menelaus, who was therefore king of Sparta. And so when She fell in love with Paris, he abducted her and took her to Troy, which then triggered the Trojan War. Now, this is, it's a complicated story, it has many different phases and episodes. This is basically the way that it's understood. Herodotus, in the beginning of his history, tries to tie this Trojan War into a wider narrative of conflict between Asia and Europe. And this kind of reflects something about the way the Greeks talked about this in the 5th century. So he says that it goes even further back than that there were other occasions where mythical figures like Io had been stolen by other people. So earlier peoples had stolen, women from Asia or women from Europe and taken them with them. And this created this sort of prolonged series of tit for tat. Who was Helen of Troy? Helen of Sparta, rather, was the daughter of the daughter of Zeus, technically. And she was eventually married off to Menelaus, who was one of the Atreides, so one of the brothers, the sons of Atreus. So that was a big event. There were many suitors to Helen's hand because as a daughter of Zeus, she was reputed to be the most beautiful woman in the world. And at the end of that, her choice for Menelaus, all the other suitors were made to swear a pact, were made to swear an oath that they would defend the sanctity of this marriage between Helen and Menelaus, which is what is activated when Helen is abducted from Sparta and the Trojan War begins, essentially. Next question. Did the gods fight in the Trojan War? According to the story, they absolutely did. In fact, they caused it, and they chose sides in it. So several different gods have their favorites. Athena is very much on the Greek side, Hera, and along with Hera as well, of course, because Paris chose against her. Aphrodite is very much on the Trojan side because Paris chose her. And there are other gods involved as well. Poseidon, Ares, Apollo, they all play their part. But various others are there to protect their own offspring, for instance, or to put their finger on the scales. At one point, Zeus wants to save his son Sarpedon and is told off by Hera because if he started doing it, all the other gods would want to do that too, like save their children from death in battle. So that kind of thing is absolutely, it's a huge factor in the story that was told, the poem that was written about the Trojan War. Which heroes fought in the Trojan War? It's a bit of a list. It's got a huge cast of characters. In fact, there's almost an inexhaustible supply of heroes, especially when you have heroes going on a rampage, going on what's called Aristeia, so an act of a series of glorious deeds. They seem to be killing heroes left and right that are all named. They get a name and a patronym. Sometimes they get an epithet or they get some kind of detail about their backstory, about their looks, their skills, their origins, their family. You get all sorts of details about these heroes. There's an absolutely vast cast of characters associated with the Trojan War in the epic poems. Only a handful of those are famous enough to now feature in a lot of stories and versions of this. You have your Achilles, Odysseus, Agamemnon, Aias, Ajax, the two different Ajaxes actually, because there are several. On the Trojan side, of course, Hector, Paris, Aeneas. But when you then later read the rest of the story, you find that there's an enormous number of additional heroes below the level of these absolute top leaders. And so in terms of which heroes fought in the Trojan War, I mean, the list is literally endless, because as soon as Homer or whoever else, another poet, needs another character, a named character to get involved in a debate or a fight, they can just, generate more. There seems to be an absolutely inexhaustible list of them. What was the Trojan horse? It's an interesting question. At its most basic level, the Trojan horse was the trick that either Epeius or Odysseus used to try and infiltrate Troy. So they built a horse, they left it behind on the beach, they pretended to flee the Greeks. The Trojans decided that the Greeks had left, that they'd won the war. They took the horse with them as a trophy into the walls. Supposedly they even had to break down some of their walls to make room for it because the horse was so big. They brought it into the walls and they celebrated and they got drunk and they fell asleep. At that point, the Greeks who had hidden themselves away inside the horse came out, opened the gates to the Greeks who had returned quietly, and that was how the city fell. So the Trojan horse is a famous sort of, metaphorical symbol still of the idea of infiltrating in secret. You are able to come in with something else that was invited, and the people who are doing it don't realize that you're in that horse. Who won the Trojan War? The Greeks. Agamemnon, Menelaus. He got his wife back. That's what he was fighting for. Fundamentally, this is the end of the Trojan Wars, that Troy is destroyed. It is sacked thoroughly by the Greeks. The city is burned down, and supposedly everybody dies except for those who get away. So later, peoples not just the Romans who famously did this with Aeneas, but many, many peoples around the world have claimed to be the last surviving Trojans who fled and resettled somewhere else. Germanic tribes did this in Roman times, and many other peoples have claimed to be the Trojans who got away from the destruction of the city. But the Greeks, thanks to the Trojan horse trick, they absolutely win. They achieve their aim. They destroy the city. They kill Priam and his family. They enslave most of the women they capture, which leads to many tragic stories after that, when the fate of these, the horrible fate of these women is considered. And it leads into other stories such as the Odyssey, as the Greek heroes tried to get home. Next question, why was the Trojan War important? I mean, so we can't talk about it historically. It's a little bit difficult because there's just no way to prove that this actually happened. If it did actually happen, then the only outcome was that the city of Troy was burned down and later resettled. But in terms of literature and culture, we can say the Trojan War is important because it is the story for the Greeks. This is absolutely the story they all know, the story they all tell. This is something that binds the Greeks together culturally. And so the Trojan War is an enormously important story, and especially Homer, especially the Iliad and the Odyssey, are just absolute cornerstones of Greek culture. And they see them, in fact, they see Homer as this unimaginable sage who is both the first historian and the first tactician and the greatest poet, and they think of him as basically being the pinnacle of all their learning, the one who gave the example for every possible thing that you could want to know about the world. So for them, this is essentially the start and the foundation of all knowledge, is to learn your Homer. And they all know it, they can all quote it, they can all recite it at each other. This is the text that absolutely everyone knows. Within that world, there is no text more important than the Homeric epics. Why did the Greeks fight the Persians? The Persian Empire emerges very suddenly in the middle of the 6th century BC, and then at that point it's basically everybody's problem. So the Persians continue to expand for a long period of time. They successfully subject the entire Middle East, Iran, parts of Central Asia, what is today Turkey and Egypt. They spread out over all these regions, and the Greek world, which is doesn't necessarily overlap just with the modern state of Greece, is essentially next in their path. So they conquer parts of the Greek world early on in their conquest in the 540s BC, and that part of the Greek world rebels in 499 BC. So that's called the Ionian Revolt, because the revolt of a couple of city-states around Ionia, which is this part of the coast of what is now Turkey. People who are leading that rebellion go to the mainland Greeks and ask for help. Most of the Greeks turn them down, but the Athenians and the Eretrians say, yes, we'll support you. They briefly do, they don't achieve very much. But at that point, the Persians become aware of the existence of these other Greek states, and the story that we are told is that from that moment, it was clear that that was going to be their next target. So why did the Greeks fight the Persians? Either because the Persians just continue to expand continuously throughout the first half century of their existence as an empire, and so Greece is just next in their path and it was inevitable. But according to the Greeks, it's also because, according to the Greeks themselves, it's also because the Greeks more or less provoked them. So there are different stories in which they essentially either harm or slight or dishonor or destroy parts of Persian land, force, temples, etc., and that the Persians think it is, vengeance is due, essentially. So that is why the Greeks fight the Persians. Next question, where was the Persian War? The Persian War is presumably... Initially, all of this fighting happens in what is now Western Turkey. So there's a couple of different campaigns to subdue the rebellious Greeks, which the Persians do quite handily. I mean, it takes them a few years, but they win all their battles, they win all their sieges, which they're much more capable of doing than the Greeks themselves because of the resources and experience they've built up. And so the Persians initially sort of re-establish their control over Asia Minor, over what is now Turkey. But then they cross over into Europe. Now, they've already done that briefly previously, so they've subjected Thrace and Macedon and some other regions, but they never kind of turned against the mainland Greek world. So now, at this point, first Darius advances across, or has his generals advance across the Aegean. So they go island to island into the west. They take a number of these islands, Euboea, Naxos, and then they land in Attica, near Athens. But that's where they are defeated at the Battle of Marathon, which is, a marathon away from Athens, literally, 42 kilometers. That's where that first big encounter happened, and that's where the Greeks learned, oh, you can win this. That's interesting. 1 decade later, Xerxes, who succeeded Darius, his father, invades again with a big royal army. He crosses into Europe, across the Hellespont. He advances first west and then south into mainland Greece. And the campaigns of that war are essentially fought around central Greece. So we're talking about Thermopylae, which is just north of modern Theba, and then south of there, south to the southwest of that, Plataea is where the decisive land battle is fought. Naval battles happen sort of just to the east in the coastal regions, first at Artemision and then at Salamis south of Athens. That's where the big battles are fought. Next question, who won the Persian War? Depends on how long you put your time brackets, always fun. Initially, the Persian invasions were thwarted. The Battle of Marathon cements the fact that Darius can advance no further west. So his campaign was a big success up to the point where he landed on the mainland, but that's where he was stopped. Then Xerxes' army and fleet are essentially destroyed by the Greeks. So that the big events of 480 to 479 is that this Persian invasion force is wiped out. And that puts a stop to Persian expansion permanently. In fact, they never resume any expansion towards the west, except that they continue to try and assert their control over the west, which also involves kind of relationships of vassalage with the Greek state. So they don't no longer try to outright conquer them, but they try to throw their weight around to make sure that these Greeks can't form a threat to Persia or infringe on the Persian ability to rule over Asia Minor, what is now Turkey. So when you're talking about who won the Persian Wars, I mean, fundamentally it is the Athenians or the Greeks, more generally the Greek alliance, that wins. But in the long run, the Persians do manage to claw back control over the regions that they were pushed out of, and eventually even get to a position where they more or less get to decide policy between the Greek states just by saying, whoever is doing anything that we don't like, we're going to support their enemies. And they support their enemies with money and ships, which are the kind of things that most of these Greek states struggle to afford. And it allows them to wage war on a much higher level and maintain empires at the kind of scale that they want. And so they end up really wanting Persian support, really vying for Persian support, and in the process kind of submitting themselves to a world that is dominated by Persia. Why was the Persian War important? Again, in terms of modern scholars have argued a lot about whether it actually matters that the Persians were defeated. In an institutional sense, the argument that this was somehow hugely important for the Greeks has been debunked to some extent by people who point out that the Greeks living under the Persian yoke already in Asia Minor get to live more or less the way they want. And in fact, even according to Herodotus, get to have things like democratic forms of government as long as they do the bidding of the Persian king. So culturally, it may not have been that important that they were able to avoid subjection to the Persians. It may not have meant that, Greek culture was preserved or the products of Greek political and cultural and literary life were allowed to flourish. A lot of that stuff may well have happened under Persian rule just as much as it did after the victory. However, there is a way in which this victory was very important to the Greeks in the sense that it really galvanized their understanding of themselves as a culture that's quite apart from the Persians. So they start to think of themselves much more strongly as Greeks, Greeks against the world, Greeks against the East, and they start to think of that status as that identity as something worth celebrating. And that in itself may well have been one of the instigators of a lot of the cultural production that follows. A lot of the kind of things that they start making and doing, creating and imagining comes out of this understanding that they are something special in the world because they were able to stop Persian expansion where all the other peoples around the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East had failed to do so. Did the Spartans fight the Athenians? Yes, many times. There are at least 5 wars throughout the classical period. So we have the so-called First Peloponnesian War, the Archidamian War, the Ionian Decelean War, and the Corinthian War, and the Boeotian War. So there are many different wars in which the Spartans fight the Athenians for a period of about 90 years, which is sometimes grouped together and called something like the hegemonic wars. So it's the wars over hegemony of the Greek world. So they are vying for partial or total control over the Greeks as the leading state within that community of smaller states. Why was it called the Peloponnesian War? It's an excellent question. Actually, there were different names for this war. The Peloponnesian War is ancient as a name, as a label, but there were different names for this war that already existed in ancient times. So the reason we call it the Peloponnesian War is primarily because we tend to look at it through the eyes of an Athenian source, Thucydides, and his successor as a historian, Xenophon, who were both Athenian. So they are talking about the war of the Peloponnesians against Athens. So that's why it's called the Peloponnesian War. But of course for them, as Thucydides himself says, it was the Athenian War. How long did the Peloponnesian War last? The thing is, actually, it breaks down into two wars. The first one is about 10 years, then there's about 7 years of peace in which various campaigns were waged, including the Athenian expedition against Sicily. And then there's another period of 10 years of war, which is a much more all-out conflict. Who won the Peloponnesian War? Sparta. Surprise upset. Everybody thought actually that they would win. Not necessarily because they were the better warriors or because they had the larger army, but because they were taking the war to Attica. They were invading Attica every year. And it was generally thought in the Greek world that the Athenians wouldn't be able to stand this for very long. Their resources would run out. They would run out of food and money, and so they eventually would have to surrender. But they didn't. For a long time, they fought on. And this is something that surprised a lot of Greeks and actually made them think like, oh, this is not going the way that we thought. It seems like their resources are greater than any other state that has existed within this Greek world, and as a result they're able to sustain warfare even if they are kind of taking more of the losses than their enemies. They're able to keep going. So this war had kind of an unusual course, and the Greeks themselves were quite baffled by what was going on. And the only reason the Spartans are eventually able to win is because they get the support of the Persians. So first of all, it's because the Athenians make some terrible mistakes. They lose half their fleet in Sicily, but they're able to bounce back from that and actually cling on to a lot of the power that they'd established in the Aegean, which is, again, something that really impressed other Greeks and made them wonder if the power of Athens would ever actually be humbled. But once the Spartans managed to make an agreement with Persia to finance naval warfare, the Spartans are able to challenge the Athenians at sea, and that proves to be decisive. Now, I say that proves to be decisive. It doesn't immediately prove to be decisive. The Spartans actually lose their entire fleet twice over, but ultimately they are able to wear the Athenians down simply because the Athenian resources are constantly dwindling as they have to support this war alone, whereas the Spartans, every time something goes wrong, they call Mr. Great King of Persia and say, could we have some more money, please? And all their losses are made good. Next question. What happened after the Peloponnesian War? Kind of a long story. I mean, all of history, technically. What happened now, immediately after the Persian War is that obviously Athens had to surrender its empire. So the empire was dissolved, their fleet was scrapped, their walls were torn down, the long walls and the walls of Piraeus, their harbor. And Athens was made a subject ally of the Spartans, so they had to do the Spartans' bidding. And for a little while they do. But soon discontent with Spartan overlordship starts to take hold not only in Athens but also elsewhere. So there are other states as well that no longer enjoy existing in a world in which Sparta at this point has unrivaled hegemony. So they completely call the shots around the Greek world. They're not happy about that because they're constantly being made to fight wars against people who they have no particular quarrel with. They're constantly being made to campaign in all sorts of places that they don't want to have anything to do with. And they're unhappy with the outcome of the Peloponnesian War in general. They don't think they got their share of the spoils or their share of the benefits for fighting that war on the Spartan side. And so a lot of their Spartan allies become disaffected and the Athenians join that camp. And in 395 BC, so only 9 years after the end of the Peloponnesian War, these states band together and declare war on Sparta again. And that triggers the Corinthian War, which is a whole other story. But the fundamental point is that the Peloponnesian War doesn't settle the business of who should be in charge of the Greek world. So the questions that we've covered here really only sort of discuss a couple of the most famous wars. There are many others that continue into the 4th century. And the big one, of course, is first the subjection of the Greek world to Macedon, which happened under Philip II, and then the great conquest of his son, Alexander the Great. I haven't covered that in detail. There will be another video coming up here on History Hit. And if you enjoy that, please look out for it. And thanks very much for watching.